Great. Hey there, everyone. Um, it looks like it's almost 10 minutes past the time we were supposed to start, and no one has joined me. I only knew of one person who might be able to join in, and the rest of you were pretty much a guess, except for the three who said they couldn't. So I'm just going to go ahead and record this as a video, and if anyone does join in, you'll see them pop up as we go. So just to kind of let you know, I'm going to be looking up a lot because I have a screen behind me. It's bigger, it's up a little bit higher, and so my eyes are going to look kind of funny the whole time. Apologize about that. If I do share screen, you won't have to look at that anymore. Okay, so I did receive a few good questions about the literature review, which was the purpose of this meeting, was to go over the literature review questions that you have as you are working on actually researching your question right now, and finding sources that you'll be using next week to write your literature review draft. So we should, answer some of these questions and get you prepared. I will say that I am going to prepare probably a couple of shorter videos that go into more detail about the literature review, the steps you should be taking as you're writing, and give you some more tools. I'm still getting all of that together to post for next week. So we will have some more instruction. This isn't the only time. This is just me responding to some of your questions. All right, so one of the, I think, most important questions that was asked by people is about the goal or the purpose of the literature review. And that is, very important for us to understand. If we think about the rhetorical situation, we have to understand our purpose for writing in order to make sure that we are writing in the correct way or in an acceptable way for the project that we're doing. And so with the literature review, your goal is to highlight the relationship between sources. Where do the experts or other voices converge, come together, agree, and where do they diverge? Where do they disagree with one another? Where do they offer maybe some competing perspectives? So you have started with a question, and you are searching for information that can help you understand that question, maybe understand how to answer the question, maybe understand what other questions you need to ask. You are basically getting an understanding of the whole conversation on the topic and where it leads you. And we know from our Habits of the Creative Mind that unlike the way many of us have been taught or expected to write in the past, even some in English 101, we've been expected to say, okay, well, here's my question, here's my answer to that question, my own personal answer to that question, which I turn into a thesis statement. And then I go find support for my thesis statement. And many times I'm also required to include a counter argument that I then have to rebut. So I'm going to go find someone who disagrees with me and, choose a soundbite from them that I know I can come back and say, well, they make a good point, but, and so that's where we've been taught to write, how we've been taught to do research. And it's good because it gives us a structure. It gives us a format to follow. It gives us a process that we can use. Well, this literature review asks us to deviate from that process in specific ways. One of those is we are starting with our question, but we're not answering that question yet. We don't have a thesis yet. So this is not a thesis-driven assignment as such. So your introduction in your literature review, and this gets at one of the other questions, one of the other questions was basically boiled, like my paraphrase of it is, can we start with a brief history of the topic to kind of give some context and background? Absolutely. your introduction should do that. It should set the stage. It should bring the readers into the topic. And if we think about reading Rebecca Solnit's Occupied Territory, she does that with her story about the dog and the feelings she has, the response she has to this unleashed dog, which is apparently a very large dog. And she's very frightened by this dog, and this dog is getting into her personal space and threatening her body. And she uses that as a way to get into this idea of space and limits on where we can go and what we can do, and that kind of thing. And then she takes that further, obviously, throughout the essay. But that serves as kind of her introduction, her setting the stage before she gets into more of the meat of what she's talking about. And you still don't see it as an argument, because it's not an argumentative piece like we've normally seen. So your literature review, you want to start it with some background, some history, some context of some sort. And you could include narrative in there like Rebecca Solnit does, or you could keep it more factual. In a traditional APA research type paper, you might have some narrative, but it's still going to be very kind of objective narrative in a way, where you're telling a story, but that story is serving the specific purpose of laying out the foundation of your research. So you can start off that way with your background and that. And you might have, instead of a thesis statement, where a thesis statement traditionally is at the end of your introduction, you might have what your driving question is there. In fact, you should have what I keep saying might, but you should have your driving question in that place. And again, I will give you a more detailed view of this. I will give you a kind of a structural map or guideline for it for next week. But for right now, just kind of take notes as we go. So you're going to start off with some background information, and that as your introduction. Your introduction should have your guiding sort of research question, whether it's written in question format or I have a couple other formats that I'll share with you as well. But it should be in there in that introduction. And then you go into the body. And remember, you are trying to highlight the relationship between sources. You're working with 10 sources. That's a lot of sources. One thing we're not going to do is go source by source by source by source, so that you have source 1, source 2, source 3, source 4. We're not doing that. That's not going to make a very interesting writing experience for you, nor is it going to make an interesting reading experience for anyone who reads your paper. And I'm not going to be the only one reading your paper, because you're going to have peer review groups that you'll be, writing workshop groups. It's not exactly the same as you may have experienced peer review before, but you'll have writing workshop groups that you will be sharing your work with. And yeah. Excuse me. I am sorry. Let's have a little coffee break here. Okay. So when you get into the body, if you're not going source by source by source, what are you doing? You're going to be grouping your sources. You can group them by maybe some particular element of the information that they bring out. You can group them by the kind of source that they are. So maybe you have 3 news sources and 2 TED Talks and whatnot, like, 2 journal articles and whatnot. And so maybe you say that in the news sources, we find this information. And writer A and writer B both give us almost the exact same thing, but writer C from a different publication um, takes a different turn. And you've already had some experience with that, where you have done your trend analysis, where you've said, okay, so I read these three articles and they were all pretty much the same, but and then some of you picked up on the way language is used in those news sources. You picked up on how some sources will use certain kinds of verbs and adjectives and adverbs, while other sources will use others. Some news sources will feel like they have more negative things to say, while others will only present the positive. And then you have to think about, well, is it that source B added in negative things and why? Or did source A intentionally leave those negative things out and why? And which one helps you understand the topic overall better? And so there's some of that needs to happen. You can say then, okay, those were my news sources, but when I move on to my TED Talks, from one speaker, I get this particular understanding of this aspect of my overall topic. And this other speaker doesn't really talk about the same things as much, but they do actually come to similar conclusions. Or speaker A talks about almost the same things as speaker B, but they come to different conclusions. Why? Why do they do that? How do they get there? And so you can group them in that way. You could group them by conclusions of the authors. So instead of grouping by the source type, you could say, okay, well, authors A, Q, and Y, um, they came to this conclusion. And, these four authors here came to a different conclusion. And those ones seem to be like diametrically opposed to each other. And then the rest of my sources sort of fall somewhere in between. They have more of what I would call like a compromise conclusion or a moderate conclusion. And so you can group them in that way and discuss them like that. Or maybe you can look at what the specific purposes or objectives of the sources are, which again might sort of overlap with the kind of source they are. So like news sources are supposed to, like their purpose is to report facts. Like that's ideally their purpose, is to report facts, report things that happen. Whereas a TED Talk is meant to educate and in an entertaining sort of way, mostly. And then you have like other sources, journal articles are supposed to um, give you more of the research background and findings and all of that. They're much more academic in that way. So you could, group them by their specific purposes or objectives, which again might coincide with the kind of source they are, although you might have some outliers in each category where there is a journal article that is written more like a TED Talk would be, or it does similar to a TED Talk. It has more of a relatable educational tone to it than that very dry, academic, boring tone that we often associate with journal articles. And you are grouping them in that way so that you can compare and evaluate the articles and the documents. So if you took English 101 at GRCC in the last couple of semesters, you should have gone through the information literacy toolkit in one form or another, and you would have had exercises dealing with analysis and synthesis. And you would have had to evaluate sources and all of that stuff. But analysis and synthesis is a lot of what you are doing in this literature review. The synthesis, first of all, comes in how you group your articles, which is based on an analysis of each article's kind of rhetorical situation and its purpose, its audience, its genre, um, and then it's the whatever it provides you, the whether it's giving you certain pieces of information and its purpose, objective, all of that kind of stuff. Um, and then seeing, where those kind of come together, where they converge, where they diverge, and where you have questions about that. So that would be your synthesis, but you have to analyze the rhetorical situation before you can really determine how to group them together. So there is a lot of, I guess, detail-oriented work there. But I don't want you to get bogged down into it too much, because there isn't one right way to group your sources. Whatever set of sources you have, you can probably figure out a few different ways to group them. And one thing that I might suggest is that you take Post-it notes or index cards or scraps of paper, and you write down on each one, the title or an abbreviated title of the source, its purpose, its audience, its genre, and then your biggest takeaways or questions, and kind of lay those out all together so that you can see them. Or you can do this on using Google, in the Google Drive. You could use a Jamboard and use the sticky notes on there and just set it up with a whole bunch of sticky notes that you can look at. And I'll show you an example, I think, of that in our instructional materials that I'm preparing for next week. But there are lots of different ways you can sort of lay it out, your sources, to look for the patterns. Or maybe you don't want to actually lay them out that way. Maybe you want to create a synthesis chart. Again, if you did the information literacy toolkit, you may not have been required to do a synthesis chart. My students do, but I know some other instructors do different things than that. But there, you would have at least been introduced to it in the module on synthesis, because it talks about that in the video. So you might find that a synthesis chart is more valuable to you, and maybe using some color-coded highlighting to figure out what things go together. And that honestly is the way that I did my last big research paper last year in my class, my research class, action research class. It's been a year, I can't remember what it's called. So yeah, so there are different ways to get to this point where you've grouped your sources. So then once you do have them grouped, you're going to compare and evaluate the different articles or documents or videos or whatever it is you have in each of those groups. And you're going to constantly be coming back to how that helps you understand your question, how that helps you come to a potential answer to your question, or maybe possibly a couple of valid answers to your question. So you'll want to, spend some time really looking at how you want to group them, but don't overthink it. And I say that as an overthinker who has a really hard time even organizing my office, because I can think of 10 different ways to organize or to put my books on my shelves. Yeah, it's a problem. It really is. But yeah, so you are going to then spend your literature review sharing basically what is the conversation about your topic. What are other experts or speakers, people who have interest in the topic, saying about it? And how does that help you come to this understanding so that you can answer your question? And so for the literature review portion, you would maybe conclude with what we would think of as a thesis statement, or a thesis statement in progress, which would be the answer to your question. Yeah, so that's kind of the the overall sort of structure, format, the purpose of the literature review. And then I had a couple questions about length and citations. So the length of your literature review is really it's not something I'm going to say you have to have X length. You have to have 10 sources, and you have to give fair treatment to those 10 sources in your literature review. I will say that if you look at the creative research document, and let me share my screen real quick. Okay. So if you look at this creative research document, and you go to the last page that's there right now, the last slide on APA resources, you'll see my literature review example listed here. Okay, so you can see that in my essay, I had 4 paragraphs of introductory material, and that introductory material does lay out my whole situation. Like what is, it talks about what I do and where and with whom and why I'm doing this research. And then I go into my review of related literature. Now mine, and this is honestly, I'm not giving you the whole paper for one major reason, and that is that I am planning to spend some time this summer on revisions, and I think I'm going to do a major overhaul of it and then send it out for publication. So I don't want the entire paper kind of out and available yet. So mine does go a little bit more of the source by source than I wanted it to. But so that was going to be one of my major overhauls of it. But you can see that here I have one source and another closely related source in the first paragraph. And then I have another source that comes up. So that's a third source, which gets a lot more attention. And then my fourth one has its own paragraph. One thing to keep in mind, even though I go source by source on these, I have a recursive model where I'm constantly relating that information to what I've already learned, what I've already taken from the other sources. So there is a little bit of that grouping that happens. And there's my fifth major source there. And you can see that I have about 3.5 pages. 3.5 pages of that information on my 5 major sources right here have 3.5 pages. One thing I will say is that I was supposed to have a 10-page limit for my whole project. So I did cut out a lot of stuff for this. So I wasn't writing a separate literature review. That was one part of our project, and we were limited to 10 pages total. So I would, ideally, if I were writing a literature review on its own as a standalone thing, I would have a lot more than 4 or 3.5 pages for 5 sources. But we work with what we have. So I did cut out a lot of stuff, and there are other sources that are as part of my project that are not listed, are not dealt with specifically in the literature review. They come up in different places. Such as this writing down the bones and bird by bird. So you can see in my paper, I have a total of 7 sources, and my paper itself ended up being I want to say 15 pages. Yeah, I know I had a limit of 5. See my problem, or 10. See my problem. So there's a lot of work I still have to do on this. And you can read this and see how I've done it and see how, I would say the things that I think it does well are taking out the important pieces of information, the important ideas and questions from the sources that I was using, and then creating a pretty decent flow from one to the next and how they sort of built up to my program revision. So this was basically a part of revising how I teach, particularly English 101, although I've also used it in other English 102 classes. Um, and so that was basically what the deal with this whole research project was. And so you'll see references to like my program revision and that kind of stuff. And then I did include in here, so I have several pages that follow with data related material because it's an action research project. So I was collecting data throughout a semester, from student work, from student reflections that they did, surveys that they participated in, that they completed, and some other comments and things that they gave. So I have a lot of that with the data, the methodology, the data collection, and that. And then the implications for future work basically serves as my conclusion along with final thoughts. And I do not know why this is a different font and size and spacing than the first part of it. Um, it shouldn't be. And so again, that's something I'll have to go back and look at. And my implications for future work and final thoughts sections will be changing in my revised version that I hope to have finished sometime midsummer. So yeah, so that is one example, and I will have other examples for you to look um, at other times. But I would say for your 10 sources, if you aim for maybe 7 or 8 pages, that would be good. If you fall a little short of that, and I mean a little short by like maybe you only have 5.5 or 6 pages, then you'll probably be okay. You might not have the meat that you need, but I want to focus more on quality of what you have than quantity of what you have. That does not mean that you can turn in 3.5 pages because you have 10 sources and all 10 of them have to appear in your literature review. There's another we've looked at before briefly, this other student paper, which is an APA formatted research paper. It is different than what you're doing, but you can look at it for basic APA guidelines as far as like how you set up the paper, where you have page numbers and what margins you have and how you format things within the text and whatnot. And then the other question that I had was about citations. You have the same basic requirements as you had for your MLA work in English 101, those of you that have taken that. And if you are starting from scratch right now, and I'm aware there are some of you in the class who are returning after several semesters or more off, or you did not take English 101 at GRCC because maybe you took it somewhere else or you didn't, whatever. I know there are some of you are starting from scratch, so I'm going to give you more detail on this in a short video that I'm going to make for you. But basically, when you quote from, paraphrase, or summarize anything or borrow anything, wording, whatever, from one of your sources, you have to give credit to that source. So if we go back to my example here, we can see that here I consulted One of the first pieces I consulted was Researching Habits of Mind, Self-Efficacy in First-Year College Writers by Peter Host, 2017. So this Host 2017 is part of my citation. In this case, it's part of like the sentence itself, right? When I come down a little farther, and I'm referring to Host 2017, that's part of my introductory material, found that metacognitive activity focused on habits of the mind rather than on the topics and assignments themselves, quote, is likely to increase their self-efficacy as academic writers. That's the end of the quote, but then I have to put where in that source I got it from, which happened to be page 287, and then I have my period. That's the end of the sentence. So I've already given the title of the work earlier, right? And the author. I've restated that this is the author of this piece that I'm talking about. This is the author that I've taken this quote from. And then in parentheses, and we call these either parenthetical citations or in-text citations, whatever information I haven't given already needs to appear here. So if I've given the author and the date, the year of publication, then all that's left is the page number, if there is a page number. If I have not given all of that information yet, so I've come down here, I determined blah, 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 scaffolding, ability to use novel. So I've got these habits of mind scaffolding here, and I've taken much of this information, not word for word, but I've summarized it, put it into my own words, and that comes from this source, Council of Writing Program, by the Council of Writing Program Administrators, National Council of Teachers of English, and National Writing Project 2011. It's not a page number, there's no page number, so I don't have to include that, but these are the authors, and I do have to include them because I haven't given that information up here. Yeah, and then, but I did give the title up here, Framework for Success in Post-Secondary Writing. So what this does is these in-text citations, the parentheticals, along with the other information that we give in the sentences themselves, they key down to the references page. So we can see here's the National Writing Project Framework for Success in Post-Secondary Writing that I've already mentioned up there. I've followed the rules for who gets to be cited here. And then, you know, my first source, Peter Host, is here, you know, and then researching habits of mind, self-efficacy, blah, blah, blah. There are different rules for those of you who have done MLA. There are different rules about exactly what goes where and what the order of the information is, and the punctuation and capitalization and that stuff, all of the formatting and everything. So I have included here in our APA resources the in-text citations made easy. This is a video. Make sure that, yeah, that's a video done by this person who is a student she makes really good videos. I've got a couple of hers here. So she makes really good videos about how to do your in-text citations. If you watch her videos, take notes, or even just watch her videos and pause and do your thing as she's teaching, you'll be golden. I mean, it'll do you a good, it'll be really good. And then I want to see, yeah, this is her again, where she teaches you the reference page. And since she's done such a great job on her videos, I don't feel the need to make new videos because she does it very well. And then this hanging indent tutorial, this is good. This is one that I learned from her. I didn't know this before, but she knows it. And so she teaches you how to do it. It's really good. And then the DOI or URL, again, it's the same girl, and it's pretty straightforward information. And then we leave her Those were all the videos that she had on APA that worked for you. I've given you a link to the whole comprehensive Purdue Online Writing Lab APA resources. So you could look there. And then there's this chart on the key differences in the format between MLA and APA. And that's a good place for those of you who have done MLA before and you want to have that visual on APA and how it compares. There's that, but also in that same, at that same link, there is a citation generator that you could use to help you. Those of you that did not do or want a refresher on the synthesizing module from the Information Literacy Toolkit in English 101, I have given you a link to that tutorial video as well. So you go to the subject guides, I'll open that up, you go to the subject guides, and then you can click on this video and watch Beyonce as a feminist icon in popular music. But this teaches about research synthesis, how it works. It breaks it down pretty easily. And then you can, it introduces the idea of a synthesis chart, and you can look at that as well. And yeah, so that is pretty much how that works there. And then again, my literature review example as it stands right now, and ideally it will be revised drastically and be much better by midsummer. And if I do meet my goal of getting that done, maybe I'll share it with you guys and see what you think. You can be my critiquers, my peer review, my writing workshop people. All right, so I believe that I have covered all of the questions that were shared with me. I'm going to leave that form open though for the rest of the week so that if more questions do come in, I can address those in the materials that I'm preparing for next week. And again, if you were hoping to be able to join the live, but it didn't work out for you, but you want to have a live meeting with me, a Zoom meeting with me anyway, please contact me and let me know what your availability is so that I can try to meet that and meet with you on Zoom. We can get an appointment set up. And if there are enough people who have overlapping availability and I'm able to do it at that time, then I will go ahead and schedule another one of these meetings just for a Q&A. I won't give a lecture and record the whole thing. But yeah, so thank you for those of you who were able to submit some questions. I hope that I have given you some good answers, even though I didn't have a lot of visuals for this particular session. Some of the questions didn't come in enough time for me to finish getting them ready. I was actually just kind of doing notes in that so that I could make some, but I didn't have enough time to get them all in a visual form for you. So I'll get that as part of the teaching materials for next week. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and let me know via the form or email or carrier pigeon if you have any other questions.